Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We continue with the discussion that we began last time, and it was connected with the status of the English language in Middle English period. The basic idea was that at some point it began to deteriorate, and finally it became a collection of separate dialects. But then, because of the 100 Years' War, the status of the English language began to change, simply because it became unpatriotic to use the language of the enemy. While having a war with France, it was quite unnatural to speak French and to use it as the national language. The key problem the people who wished to use the English language in all spheres of human life had to encounter was that of lexis. It's clear that when the English language in the beginning of the Middle English period began to exist only in its conversational style, all other words either denoted abstract notions or emotional states or some specific objects were simply absent in the English language. And it was necessary to get them from somewhere if the language had to contain units useful for the discussion of some abstract notions, expressive states, emotional states, object of reality. But it was not necessary just for somebody to find the words and to use them. It was necessary for the speech community, for the people using the English language, to accept these words. Otherwise, it would have remained individual usage of a particular author, and the words would not have become part of the English language. So there were two problems: to get the units from somewhere, and then to make them sufficiently widespread, to make them part of the national language. And for any word to become a part of a national language, it's necessary to make sure that a sufficiently large number of people are using the word just introduced by somebody. In the absence of printing, the problem could have remained quite acute, and it was necessary to have a sufficient amount of copies of a text containing a particular word or a particular collection of words to make sure that they would finally form part of the national language. And in this situation, significant efforts had to be made to enlarge the vocabulary of the English language. It wasn't done really consciously by any body of people responsible for promoting and enlarging the English language. It was done without much deliberation. It was not a unified effort of the nation, but due to the particular historical conditions of the time, it so happened that at least three spheres of usage became widely popular, and due to the activity of various groups of people quite disconnected with each other, the words they introduced into the English language finally became the common property of the nation as a whole. There are three main sources of enlarging the vocabulary and developing the insufficient system of styles existent in the then English language. The three main sources are the works of great writers, like Geoffrey Chaucer, William Langland, and John Gower. The work of the officials, чиновники, responsible for carrying out daily work with the official documents in England. And this group of people are called the clerks of the chancery. Клерки канцелярии, чиновники канцелярии. And the third, quite unexpected source, which contributed to the enlargement of the English language, were religious writings, which in all other countries at that time would be done in Latin. But in England, there appeared a very specific situation when religious writings, for some reason, were produced, great amounts of them, in the vernacular, in the English language. So there were those three sources, and all of them, for various reasons, became sufficiently popular among the nation for the people to read these texts, to begin to write their own texts on the basis of the primary sources, and as a result, use the words as well as the syntactic constructions initially introduced by other people in the English language. And in this situation, when words were found, they were invented or they were borrowed, they were used in texts, and then other people read those texts and produced texts of their own. This was the ideal situation when the real enlargement of the English language would have taken place. Otherwise, if people produced the texts and nobody read them, and nobody tried to imitate them, the lexical materials, the syntactic materials, the morphological changes they introduced would never have become part of the English language. That's the important point. To introduce an example which would make the situation clearer, we must look, for example, at the works of some Russian poets at the turn of the century. Рассмейтесь, смехачи, and all that sort of thing, produced by Велимир Хлебников, Крученых, and other people, never actually became part of the Russian language. Nobody felt like imitating the style of Daniel Harms or of Велимир Хлебникov, of course, was the inventor of new lexis. So, individual efforts may sometimes bring no practical results and no enlargement of the national language, in our case Russian or the English language that we're discussing now, will take place. But if the speakers of the language accept them, use them, imitate the style of the initiators, then the language actually is enriched. And this is something that actually happened in the 14th century, obviously for political reasons, for social reasons, which made a significant influence on the cultural situation in the country. When we think about the changes in the history of the English language, in the state of the English language in the 14th century, the only people that are really popular in works on the history of English turn out to be the great writers. And there is a feeling that because of Geoffrey Chaucer's efforts, or because of John Langland's efforts, the English language was enriched. But we must remember that the lexical material they were using would not be sufficient to cover all the needs of the nation in those times. For example, the Canterbury Tales, the famous work by Chaucer, who had previously been writing both in Latin and in French, and in the year 1387 probably, he began writing his Canterbury Tales. What he was writing about? We have the collection of 23 stories, quite disconnected with each other. And the plot is very simple. 29 pilgrims meet in the Tabard Inn in Southwark, in London. They're all planning to go to a pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury. The popular pastime in those times, when you wished to have some touristic activities combined with the spiritual experiences. All of them probably have their sins, or they want to be cured from some illnesses, I don't quite remember. But this group of 29 people meet at this inn, at this hotel, and they're planning to go to Canterbury. As the way will take some time, the host of the inn, хозяин гостиницы, suggests that they should shorten the way by each telling 2 stories on the way there and 2 on the way back. As a result, each of the pilgrims has to tell 4 stories, and if we multiply and get the final figure, it would be 116 stories. Chaucer never wrote that amount of text. The amount of stories is just 23. And so after this general prologue, in which Chaucer explains that people get together and they're planning to go to Canterbury, the stories actually begin. Socially, the group is not uniform. We have the squire, the prioress, the nun, the shipman, so various representatives of professions, different professions, different social classes, and they will tell stories quite disconnected with each other. These could be romantic stories, these could be socially interesting stories, some satirical stories, and most of these texts were borrowed from the French and Italian literature. And the disconnected stories are brought together by minor prologues, and in each prologue there is an explanation of who is going to speak and how the people around react. So from our point of view, the text is rather primitive, a collection of disconnected stories, and most of them were borrowed. So as a result, in the modern opinion, we receive an example of plagiarism. Chaucer's contemporaries loved those texts. The less educated ones obviously didn't know the sources of borrowings. The more sophisticated ones knew the sources of borrowings, but somehow they didn't mind. The text became very popular, and nobody really ever spoke about Chaucer as a person engaged in very rough practice of plagiarism. The thing is that in those times, people didn't mind hearing a story, listening to a story, or reading a story they have already heard or read 100 times. If there were at least some changes in the traditional story, they would be very happy and call it a masterpiece. With Chaucer, in fact, there were not 100% exact borrowings. For example, in a story about a Christian boy who is murdered by horrible, cruel Jews, we have at first sight a very clear example of the medieval anti-Semitism. But in fact, the text is produced by a prioress, настоятельница, who is not a very reliable or pleasant person to deal with. And in the prologues, the description of the prioress is given. So, because Chaucer makes the prioress produce the story about a poor Christian boy, we begin to doubt that actually her words should be treated at their face value. We may have doubts. And in this sense, Chaucer becomes quite original. Due to the expectations of the reader, it must be just an ordinary piece of anti-Semitism, but in fact, it becomes something completely different. Chaucer is humorous about it, he's satirical, and probably he defies this idea of anti-Semitism entirely. So, in fact, Chaucer's texts, though they may seem primitive, unoriginal, even from the conceptual point of view, look quite interesting. And they were interesting to the modern readers just because of this. But also, of course, they were interesting because of the linguistic fact. Chaucer in his texts covers various subjects. When speaking about various subjects, you need various words, and these various words were mostly absent in the English language. So Chaucer had to carry out borrowings. And he mainly borrowed from French, quite reasonably, because if he were to begin to do something using the old English material, it was very likely that he would not be understood by the readers. And as he was still writing for a sophisticated audience with some knowledge of French and Latin, he would hope that his texts would be understood, even though they contained words which formerly had never been used in the English language. And also, he believed that it would be useful to use synonyms, because sometimes an English word existed which did not cover all the niceties or complexities of the potential meaning of a word, of a concept, to be rendered. And in this case, synonymity worked very well, or simply it was the author's desire to explain the unknown borrowed word from through the authentic, which was already commonly accepted. As a result, the English readers received the following collection of texts. The example for our previous lecture, the second sheet of paper, contains the first lines of the general prologue from the Canterbury Tales. I wouldn't try to reproduce the specificity of Middle English pronunciation, it's all a matter of reconstruction. But if we think of how it could have sounded, probably that would be the way to speak. Juan sat April with his sure sote, the draught of March has passed to the rote, and buzzed every vine in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus ate with his sweaty breath, in spirit has in every holt and has, sometimes the tender croppers and the young sonne, has in the ram his halve kurs verunne, and smale fade smaak en melodie het slepen in old the nicht with open ear, so prickes hem naturen her courageous, san long in folk to go on pilgrim marches. And the English translation, which is much easier, of course, to understand, and which is much closer to the original Middle English text than it had been the case with the religious writings we have been looking through during the previous lecture. When April with his showers sweet with fruit, the draft of March has pierced into the root and bathed each vein with liquor that has power to generate the rain and sow the flower, when Zephyr also has with his sweet breath quickened again in every heart and has the tender shoots and buds, and the young sun into the ram when half his course has run, and many little birds make melody that sleep through all the night with open eye, so nature brings them on to rampant rage, then do folk long to go on pilgrimage. У меня смешивается среднеанглийский с новоанглийским, я ошибаюсь в современном тексте, простите, пожалуйста. Значит, если посмотреть, да, на заимствование, showers, заимствование, fruit, тут нет, fruit в среднеанглийском нет. Percet, wine, liquor, virtue, engendered, fleur, in spirit, tender, course, melody, courageous, pilgrimages. Quite a number of words, some of them expressive adjectives, some of them words giving names to material objects, some of them giving names to abstract notions. Quite a collection of words which will be clear to the reader from the context, and for them at least, it was an example of good poetry. So people were ready to read it, those who could, or to listen to it if they couldn't read, to learn it by heart. Of course, they would not collectively, all of them, begin writing literary texts of verbal art. But all the same, the practice of reading and learning would help to enlarge the language of the soul. There are people who love texts like Beowulf, the Canterbury Tales. It depends on the taste, of course, because here it's a matter of likes and dislikes, of course. Whether we like the heroic poetry, whether we like that kind of medieval stories brought together by a prologue or prologues but disconnected with each other. So I don't invite all of us collectively to begin to admire Chaucer, for example, or to learn him by heart. But at least some idea of what his texts were like must be given if we speak about classic English poetry. So that's what he was like. He was loved, he was learned by heart, he was imitated, and this relatively long collection nowadays survives at least in 80 copies of different extent of strength, so to speak. It exists in longer versions, shorter versions, but 80 is quite a good figure, indicating the popularity of the text in Chaucer's England. As we see, Chaucer's texts do require translation into modern English. They are not as difficult as Old English texts for understanding, but still in them we see the instability of the orthography, showers, Schure's Drocht of March, this spelling, modern English spelling is different. Flower. Of course, we may try to guess the meaning of these words, but to make sure we understand the text, it's better still for a common reader, at least not for a specialist in the English language and the history of it, to take the modern English translation. And there are differences between Middle English and modern English, not confined to orthography only and to the pronunciation of separate words. There are considerable grammatical changes, the disappearance of various kinds of inflections, the changes in the verbal system, the disappearance still of some words which we expect to find in modern English, but we do not find them. So the distinctions are considerable, but they are not that considerable compared to what we had in Old English. It's still a different stage in the development of the language, but much closer to modern English, the way we know it. A lot would have been said about Chaucer, John Langland, William Langland, John Gower, but I will abstain from doing it because still we speak about modern classic English poetry in this course of lectures. You have the general idea of what these texts look like, and if you wish to continue your acquaintance with Chaucer, for example, you have ample opportunities to do it because the texts are widely available both in the internet, in the libraries, and so on. Now we continue our conversation about the sources of vocabulary, of linguistic material which existed in Middle English and which led to the efflorescence of the English language in its early modern period. As I have said, we have two more enormous sources. One of them are papers of the Chancery, the other are the works on religious subjects written by people who would be later described, or who would then be described by the official church as Catholics. Let's begin with the clerks of the Chancery and their activity contributing to a very significant development of the English language and to the standardization of it. As we remember, at some point, Middle English began to disintegrate. It became a collection of separate dialects. And to create a national language, which would be generally accepted by the population, it was necessary to create texts which would be fairly similar linguistically, morphologically, phonetically, syntactically, and lexically. Because if everybody wrote in his own private dialect, and if people in York, for example, produced texts of the official kind in their own dialect, they would not be understood in London, and vice versa. As a result, there would be a collection of official styles produced in different dialects of the English language. As a result, it would not lead to the creation of a national language in the proper sense of the word. But that was something that actually happened. The English language, yet again, was getting uniform, now not on the basis of the Winchester dialect, which was used during the Old English period, the Wessex dialect, but on the basis of the dialects of the English language used in Oxford, Cambridge, and in London. And this happened due to the activity of the clerks of the Chancery and due to the activities of the religious writers in the country. So, the Chancery were a I'm speaking about we because I mean a group of people. Clerks of the Chancery were a unified group of people who worked on official papers in an office of the Chancellor of England, understand, the Chancellor Cancelliere. Initially, it was a rather small group of people who began their work at the end of the 12th century. But then, as the amount of official texts proliferated, it became necessary to enlarge this group of people who were sending official papers to various parts of England, who sent instructions, laws, orders of the king to various parts of England. And all in all, in the 14th century and in the 15th century, about 100 people were working in the Chancery. Not a very small group of people, but all of them, incidentally, had the education of Oxford and Cambridge as their background, with the sufficiently unified language, which was used in those educational centers. And when they got to London, they began to use this particular dialect, this particular variety of the English language in their own texts. Initially, the papers would be written in Latin and French, but in the second part of the 14th and in the 15th century, all those laws and old charters describing, for example, the distribution of land in the country were being translated into Middle English. And as a result, a lot of written material appeared, produced in fairly the same kind of English. And then, as I have said, those people who began to use their particular dialect, their particular standard of the English language, were sending these letters and papers to various parts of the country, and they expected some response from the local officials, and it was natural that people working in the provinces wanted to imitate the style of the texts they received. They didn't want to look like country bumpkins. They wished to be taken seriously by their colleagues or superiors in London. And if those provincial people ever thought of making a career and moving to London, of course they understood the necessity to use the standard language, the language accepted by their betters and their elders in the texts those betters and elders were producing. As a result, in the country, there began an enormous joint work of people engaged in official activities, working as officials, and the work was connected with producing a lot of texts written in a fairly the same style, in a fairly similar style. And as the amount of papers was great, the standard was being established in quite a natural and at the same time rapid manner. Educated people engaged in this work were of necessity producing a lot of texts. So what they wrote, of course, remained in their memory. What they read remained in their collective memory. And as a result, the educated people from the middle of the 14th century began to use this unified dialect, which, of course, finally became the basis of the national standard English language. So that was the second very important source, and numerous papers survive from this period in the British archives, in the English archives. So the significance of the work of these people cannot and shouldn't be underestimated. And then the completely unexpected contribution in the development of the English language was made by people writing on religious matters. Last time I've already explained why it's difficult to imagine people in the 14th century suddenly beginning to write on religious matters in their national languages. In the whole of Europe, the language used in serious papers connected with religious matters was Latin. No translations into national languages of the Bible at that time existed. If we think about Europe at large, we remember that Martin Luther, one of the fathers of the Reformation, began his work in the 16th century, and the year 1517 is used conveniently to mark the beginning of Reformation in earnest in Europe. And it was only then that the work on producing the biblical texts in German, for example, or in other European languages began. Before that, there were no conditions for creating the national variants of the Bible. The Church entirely forbade this kind of activity, and most European countries were ready to obey, but not England. And this is a very unexpected turn of events, because still Reformation, in our opinion, is associated with Germany, with Switzerland, with the Scandinavian countries, but not with England. In England, it also took place in the 16th century, but paradoxically, much earlier, in the 14th century, this work had also been done in England, which makes this country absolutely unique in the religious history of Europe. The Bible translation was universally banned because the priests were practically the only people who could read the biblical text in Latin, and they didn't want the spread of this sacred knowledge among the populace. For us, the efforts of the church to keep their monopoly on the interpretation of the biblical text is quite strange, but in fact, we must remember that the Bible really was the main book in those times. It was believed to contain the knowledge of how the world was created, the basic scientific knowledge, the basic historical knowledge, some moral instruction, even some poetic texts. And of course, the fewer the people who have the access to the sacred book, the greater the likelihood that people, the rest of them, would be controlled. Because whenever you say that I'm not going to obey the king, I'm not going to obey the church, you are given a clear answer. It is written in the Bible that we should obey the church and the king. And although in the Bible there might be pieces that show that it is not always necessary to obey the king and the church, especially as in those times when the Bible was written, there was no Christian church in its modern understanding. It's much easier for the people working in this religious sphere to make others obey them if they have a monopoly on reading this text and interpreting it. That is why the church was very actively against the Bible translation. And it was for this reason that only the 16th century in Europe saw the active work in this sphere. But in England, as I've said, the situation was different. The variant of the Bible traditionally used in Europe was the 14th century translation made by a person called Saint Jerome, Святой Иеремия. It was translated in the 4th century, and since then, practically without any changes, the book was not actually published. It was not published in the sense that it was not put in print, but the versions which existed were the exact replica of the variant of the Bible produced by Saint Jerome. Of course, there were periodically attempts by various European scholars to give alternative variants of the interpretation of the Bible, but on the whole, the Church controlled this work quite well, and if some people suggested interpretations which were not acceptable to the spiritual leaders of the then Europe, they would be proclaimed heretics, and the heretical writings would be destroyed. The heretics themselves mostly would be executed. So heresy had existed during the whole history of Christianity. The moment the interpretations of the Bible were suggested, some of them turned out to be more acceptable, some of them turned out to be less acceptable, and the official church, protecting its integrity and its monopoly on the interpretation of the biblical text, would be actively fighting all those who produced texts which were not acceptable to the official church. And there had been powerful heretical movements which were proclaimed heretical in Europe in the 12th, 11th century, the famous Cathars, Albigensians, Waldensians, and at the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, there was such a strong dispute connected with the main points of Christianity that the then Pope of Rome, called Innocent III, even had to declare a crusade against the so-called heretics. It was an unthinkable thing. Crusades were usually organized against the so-called infidels. But in this case, uniquely, the Pope of Rome, a very bright figure in the religious history, not very attractive, but undoubtedly of great authority, the Pope, Innocent III, announced the crusade against fellow Christians, the Cathars. And then horrible bloodshed took place. They were located, the people who adhered to this heresy at the south of France, and the local aristocrats and people from the more distant parts of Europe were offered by the Pope, first of all, absolution, and then the money of the people and the goods of the people they were going to kill, if those nobles agreed to attack the Cathars, the Albigensians, which was actually done, and there were quite horrible periods in this history of the bloodshed. Some people say it's a kind of fairy tale, but if it is a fairy tale, it's a very telling example of the cruelty of the nobles attacking the heretics. When a town was attacked by the Crusaders, and it was known that in the town not only the heretics were living, but good Christians as well, Some military leaders asked the priest who was with them attacking the town, how should we tell the good Christians from the bad Christians? And the answer the spiritual leader gave was, kill them all, God will know his own. Я повторю по-русски. В конце XII, начале XIII века был совершенно уникальный эпизод в истории христианской церкви, когда правящий на тот момент римский папа Иннокентий III объявил крестовый поход не против неверных, а против еретиков, катаров, альбегойцев, вальденцев, если они там, катары, альбегойцы точно. Был объявлен крестовый поход против христиан, которые были еретиками с точки зрения церкви, но они были христианами. Но в такой степени уже официальная церковь устала от критики своих базовых постулатов, которые очень успешно осуществляли катары и альбегойцы, что римский папа объявил крестовый поход против них и обещал, ну, во-первых, отпущение грехов, и, во-вторых, на практическом уровне все имущество еретиков тем, кто будет участвовать в крестовом походе. Ну, в основном, конечно, аристократам, воинам тех времен, либо живших неподалеку от Тулузы, где, собственно, распространялась альбегойская ересь, или готовых прибыть из более далеких частей Европы для того, чтобы, так сказать, утвердить истинную веру и улучшить свое финансовое положение. И альбегойские войны длились достаточно долго. Иннокентий правил с 1198 года по 1116-18 лет. Ну, где-то в конце нулевых был объявлен крестовый поход. Уникальная совершенно акция, которая показывала, насколько тяжело римско-католической церкви на тот момент было мириться с еретическими течениями, которые явно били куда-то в нужные и очень болезненные точки. И понятно, что истории с разных сторон рассказываемые будут вызывать сочувствие тех, кто рассказывает, но какие-то вещи санкционирования официальной церковью были очевидно злодейскими. И знаменитый рассказ, который я повторил, связанный с атакой на один из альбегойских городов, ну, естественно, его можно воспринимать как апокриф, как легенду, но он очень показательный. Когда священник, находившийся с армией крестоносцев, перед атакой на город, где жили и добрые христиане, и еретики, когда этого священника спросили, как же при атаке на город отличить добрых христиан от еретиков, священник якобы, если считать это легендой, сказал: убивайте всех, Бог узнает своих. Это очень показательный момент, да, было, не было, мы не знаем, но, в принципе, именно в таком духе официальная церковь работала с еретиками. И, естественно, в конечном итоге катары, вальденцы, альбегойцы были уничтожены, но сама идея альтернативных интерпретаций Библии и роли церкви, естественно, всегда оставалась в европейском религиозном сознании. И церковь претендовала на монопольную интерпретацию священных книг, но поскольку мы понимаем, что и в Библии есть тексты, явно противоречащие друг другу, с одной стороны, Христос принес не мир, но меч, а с другой стороны, подставить левую правую щеку, да, другую щеку. Уже этот пример показывает, насколько вообще сложно интерпретировать части Библии, потому что очень часто в других частях содержится прямо противоположное утверждение. И, естественно, официальная церковь претендовала на уникальность и правильность их интерпретации, а люди, знавшие Библию хорошо, теологи в первую очередь, знавшие, что в других частях Библии написано совсем другое, и настаивавшие на своей собственной правоте, конечно, становились на пути официальной церкви и по возможности уничтожать. So this was something that happened to Albigensians, the Catars, but the tendency was there. It was the 13th century France. And then in the 14th century England, roughly the same situation repeated itself. And the only difference was that the so-called heretics here were not supported just by some local aristocrat, the way Albigensians had been supported by the Count of Toulouse, but still it was just a count, Graf Toulouse, and here we have the English king, Edward III, supporting the heresy. And with the experience of the 12th century, when Henry II, who was not supporting any heresy, but who was behaving in an uncivilized manner, and he was excommunicated at Lucerne, we could expect the excommunication of Edward III. It never actually happened because the church at that time could not allow itself to go that far. But of course, Edward III was heading for trouble, and he would have received it had it not been for the general weakness of the church in those days. So the situation was as follows. Edward, since he was 25 years old, was leading a war against France because he wanted the French throne. And the Roman Church, who could have served as a kind of arbiter, as a kind of judge, in fact was not in a position to do it. It was not in a position to address, from the objective point of view, the English and the French king, telling them to find some kind of reconciliation. The trouble was that the Roman Church at that time was experiencing a great crisis, and it couldn't have really been called the supreme spiritual body with authority over all European countries, because the 14th century was the period of the famous Avignon captivity of popes, так называемое Авиньонское пленение пап. Since the year 1305, 32 years before the 100 Years' War began, the popes of Rome were in fact residing in Avignon and were controlled by French kings. Later, Avignon officially became an independent city because the Pope bought this city from the Countess of Savoy, on whose lands the city was situated. But in fact, it was clear that, of course, the popes were strictly controlled by the French court and by the French kings. And this Avignon captivity lasted for 73 years. It finished in 1378, 1379, when the popes eventually returned to Rome. But here the troubles did not finish, because some representatives of the clergy got to Rome, some others still remained in Avignon, and they elected a pope of their own. So there was the split in the spiritual authority in the then Europe. And at some point, 3 alternative popes were existing and functioning simultaneously. So the authority of the church in this case was greatly compromised, and the local national churches were consequently not as authoritative as they used to be, simply because in the central body there were such unspeakable troubles. Помимо авиньонского пленения, когда, конечно, папы потеряли авторитет из-за их полного подчинения французским королям, после завершения этого 73-летнего пребывания в Авиньоне было еще, ну, так, 37-39 лет совершенно дикой ситуации, когда на территории Европы действовали одновременно 2 или даже 3 римских папы. Впоследствии в церковной истории все будет подкорректировано, будет обнаружен в каждом случае конкретный папа, который вроде бы имел законное основание на то, чтобы носить этот титул, а остальные его конкуренты, которые на тот исторический период функционировали тоже как папы римские, они в римской современной истории объявлены антипапами. Вы понимаете, какой авторитет могла иметь организация, где вместо одного руководителя вдруг оказывается сразу 2 альтернативных или даже 3. И все это продолжалось до 1415-1417 года, когда собрался наконец очень авторитетный церковный орган, ну, вроде бы высший, да, в церковной иерархии собор, он проходил в городе Констанце, и Константский собор наконец покончил с этим диким положением, с троепапством на тот момент. Все ненужные кандидаты были низложены. Действующий папа, по-моему, сохранил титул, но был вынужден отречься, и в результате был найден удобный, по-моему, на тот момент германским императором кандидат, если ничего не путает, был Мартин V, могу ошибаться. Ну, вот вы видите, что с 1305 года по 1415-17 римская церковь, конечно, очень сильно утратила свой авторитет, и претензии на духовное лидерство, претензии финансовые на тот момент выглядели неубедительно. And for this reason, King Edward III, who was of course a very practical man and who needed the money in his fight with the so-called, no, not with the Catholic, sorry, needed the money in his fight with France, was trying to save money. And when he saw that it was possible not to pay to Rome and to leave the money in the royal treasury, he gladly accepted this idea. And he also wanted to limit the power of his own clergy, to make them contribute to the royal treasury. And there was always this issue causing considerable debate between the crown and the church. When the place of a bishop in a country became vacant, the king usually suggested a candidate who was to be approved of by the Pope. But in the absence of the candidate, the money, considerable money from this bishopric, would go either to Rome or to the king, preferably to the king. So it was generally quite profitable for the king not to appoint bishops. And when the bishops were appointed, again, it was a tradition that the income for the first year, which would be accumulated in a bishopric, should also go to the king and not to Rome. And Edward III also tried to use these opportunities to ingratiate himself, and to enrich himself a little bit. And in this case, he, of course, needed ideological support, and he, to his pleasure, saw that in England in those times, a very active group of people was being formed who were ready to repeat the old ideas familiar since the times of the Cathars and Albigenses about the necessity to limit the power of the church. And in the handouts, we have the example of this kind of writing, the 12 conclusions of the Lollards. Of course, these are not the poetic texts, they're thoroughly prosaic, but it's a good example of the then English language, by the way, because these texts were written in English, in Middle English. We have in our variants, the translation into modern English. But first of all, look at the richness of the lexis and syntax. That is something that is important for us in our discussion of the way the English language developed. And also the ideology of the text is significant because it shows why the king, for example, was ready to support the Lollards. So, state of the church. English church obeys Rome, but generally it shouldn't do it. The hierarchy of the kind practiced by the Catholic Church has never been accepted in the Bible. So what the Roman, or rather the Armenian Church, was doing was against the law of God described in the Bible. The priesthood. The second conclusion is this: our usual priesthood, the which began in Rome, feigned of a power higher than angels, is not the priesthood the which Christ ordained to his apostles. This conclusion is proved. For the priesthood of Rome is made with signs, rites, bishops' blessings, and that is of little virtue, nowhere ensampled in the Holy Scripture, for the bishop ordinance in the New Testament, but little of record. That's again the idea. The hierarchy should not exist. Clerical celibacy. Why should clerics remain unmarried? In fact, in this situation, they would be engaged in all kinds of illicit sexual activity. So it's not the idea coming from the Bible, it's again the wrong conclusion. Then comes the criticism of the so-called transubstantiation, the doctrine according to which during the Eucharist of Prичастия, Christ's body and blood are actually given to the believers. They say it is sacrilegious, the Lollards. Exorcisms and hallowings. Claims that the priests have the psychiatrical knowledge which allows them to make mad people turn into normal people. In fact, it is not there, and priests are taking the money for the kind of activity which is not supported by the scripture and which is generally quite useless. We may agree or disagree with what they write, but at least we see that the so-called heretics, people who were against the official church, were quite actively working. They used good English. They had the abstract vocabulary borrowed from Latin at their disposal. And those heretical writings, of course, made great influence over the state of the English language, simply because this practice was supported by the king. The English church was vehemently against it, but they could do nothing in this situation when the king was ready to support the so-called Lollards. That's the way the heretics were called. And one of them was the famous Oxford professor called John Wycliffe, in the second handout, which contains the pieces from Ecclesiastes. We have the name of the person written, the Wycliffe Bible. The Bible associated with John Wycliffe. He was born in 1320 and he died in 1384. He was a priest and he even received some income from his activity as a priest. And he was also a very prolific writer, head of a group of scholars functioning mainly in Oxford, who would be producing, first of all, papers in the spirit of the 10 conclusions of the Lollards, which was a simplified and a shorter version of the 37 articles by the Lollards, and he also supervised the work on producing the complete Bible translation into Middle English. Also a very significant kind of work leading to the standardization of the language. The Lollards, for all their heretical leanings and their heretical status and the hatred of the official Catholic or Roman Church in England and in Rome, of course, and in Edinburgh, they continued to function quite peacefully because they were protected by the king. And it lasted for about 40 years at least. Closer to the end of the 14th century, the situation began to change. Edward did not really need unanimous support of his church because he was a strong king. His heir, his grandson Richard II, was also a legitimate king. But then in the year 1399, Richard II was deposed. He lost the crown. He was deposed by his cousin Henry IV, and the right of Henry IV to become king was quite problematic and not so obvious to everybody. And in this situation, he needed the support of the church because it was a unique organization to provide ideological work and ideological support for the king. Because in every part of England, in every church, it would be said that in fact Richard II was a bad king, Henry IV was a better king and a legitimate king. And although in the Bible it is said that you should not fight with your king, in another part of the Bible it's possible to find a piece which supports the idea of fighting the king. So Henry IV needed the support of the church, because not everybody in the country was ready to accept him as the rightful king. And in this situation, the status of the church began to change rapidly. And 9 years after Henry IV became king, in 1408, the so-called Constitutions of Oxford were adopted in England, according to which any person who dared to translate the Bible, to read it in English, or to give it to other people should be executed. Nothing of this kind could have been done during the reign of Edward III or Richard II, because they simply did not need it, and they were ready to turn a blind eye on the activities of the heretics. But with Henry IV, the official church became all important yet again. And since that time, the activity of the heretics, the Lollards, was brought to naught. They had lost the power in the country. And during the whole of the 15th century, during the period of the disastrous end of the 100 Years' War, the disastrous end of the War of the Roses, no activities of the churchmen writing in the vernacular took place, but the impetus they gave the development of the language was very considerable, because their texts were read, their texts were imitated by others. And for example, the Wycliffe Bible survives in some 250 copies, of course, in various degrees of completeness. With Geoffrey Chaucer, as we remember, there were 8. But Chaucer's texts were never burned, were never prohibited, in contrast to Wycliffe's translations of the New and the Old Testament, which were strongly prohibited, categorically prohibited by the English Church and the Church of Rome. But in spite of this, 250 copies survive, which shows the enormous popularity of from the Bible translations, of the Lollard writings, and the influence their work, lexically and syntactically, and of course ideologically, would have on the development of the English language. We will stop at that. Next time we are going to look at the examples of the biblical text produced in the 14th century, because it was of enormous significance in the formation of the English literary language and the development of English literature. So the key point today was the growth of the English language in the 14th century, which was due to the activities of the great writers, the English officials, and the English religious writers, the Lollards, which are now called heretics, but who in that time were accepted and treated quite seriously by the kings of England. Thank you very much for your kind